Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining our conversation today with Dr. David Lloyd Dusenbury about his recent book, The Innocence of Pontius Pilate. My name is Steven Waldorf. I'm assistant professor at the Catholic University of America, as well as a faculty fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology, which is a co-sponsor of this afternoon's event. The Institute for Human Ecology here at Catholic University of America exists to educate university students to give the Republic her best citizens, to sponsor multidisciplinary academic research on the intersection of human flourishing and Catholic social doctrine, and to organize events encouraging conversation between the academy and the public square. So we're very grateful for IHE's support of our event this afternoon. Now, a word of introduction about Dr. Dusenbury. So Dr. David Lloyd Dusenbury is Associate Professor of Humanities in the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. His work sits at the intersection of philosophy, theology, and intellectual history. He previously held positions at the Danube Institute, the University of Antwerp, Vita Salute San Raffaele University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Loyola University in Maryland, and the Catholic University of Leuven. In addition to his book, The Innocence of Pontius Pilate, which he's going to be discussing with us today, Dr. Dusenbury is the author of 4 books: I Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus, Nemesius of Emesa on Human Nature, Platonic Legislations, an essay on legal critique in ancient Greece, and The Space of Time, Sensualist Interpretations of Time in Augustine Confessions 10 to 12. So the format of our presentation, of our discussion this afternoon, is Dr. David Dusenbury will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes about the project. I will present him some questions, and then we will open up the floor to questions and comments from the audience. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks so much, Stephen. It's such a pleasure to be with you. Thanks to all who are dialing in for this conversation. And I really do want to extend my very genuine, heartfelt thanks to the Institute for hosting this, and especially Professor Hiddinger, whom I had the pleasure of meeting in Washington not too long ago. I would only add, before I get into the material, that it's really a pleasure to put on record the fact that a lot of the research for this book was conducted at Mullen Library at the Catholic University of America. So Stephen just graciously mentioned my time working at Loyola University, Maryland, and during that semester or so in DC, I conducted quite a lot of work on the grounds of the Catholic University. So there are many reasons why I'm happy to be here, and that is one quite significant reason. So some of you might recognize the name of Ernst Kantorowicz. She was a German-Jewish medieval legal and political historian who ultimately made a brilliant career, a fascinating career, and a complex one in the United States. And Ernst Kantorowicz once remarked that through his work on medieval history, he wanted to make it impossible, I'm quoting him now, impossible to deal with the history of medieval thought and culture without ever opening a missal. So he believes that the Roman liturgy was not simply a kind of ancillary or ornamental source for medieval historians, but it was a source which no medieval historian could neglect at the peril of fundamentally misunderstanding and misrepresenting medieval thought and culture. And I suppose in the very, very broadest sense, my desire in this book and in the companion piece, which Stephen just mentioned, My Political Life of Jesus, and there might eventually be a third volume dealing with the influence of the figure of Jesus in modern Western philosophy. My desire, certainly in this book and in the broader set of studies as well, is basically just to make it impossible to deal with the history of Western thought and culture well into late modernity without referring to the Gospels. I really do not think that Western thought and culture can be understood without reference to the sacred page, and especially the drama of the life of Jesus as it is portrayed in the canonical Gospels. Not only the canonical Gospels, I'll actually have a few words to say very briefly in the coming minutes about one or two extra canonical texts. But ultimately, of course, it's the canonical Gospels which transmit to the Christian worlds of both East and West the memory of the life and death, and in Christian belief, resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so in the coming moments, I just want to introduce you to some of the perhaps surprising, I hope some of them are surprising findings, which have led me to insist upon the centrality of specifically the Roman trial of Jesus in reconstructing the legal and political history and imaginary of Europe over the last 21 centuries. And we can begin just by noting the fact, which is strangely enough not noted by most modern legal historians, that the very first words of Justinian's body of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, are in fact in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so this is where the book begins, with simply a notation of the fact and a reflection on the fact that the name of a Roman convict, Jesus, stands at the head of the entire body of Roman law, which I think all who have dialed in will probably either know in detail or have some sense that this body of Roman law has had a tremendous, continent-shaping influence, which is visible all the way through to certainly 19th and 20th century European code laws. So we see at the very beginning of in a meaningful sense, the European legal tradition in late antique Christian Rome, a reference to the Roman trial of Jesus, a tacit reference to the Roman trial of Jesus. And then I also draw attention to the fact in the second chapter of the book that at the beginning of the early modern epoch of national and especially international law, which most legal historians would date to the person and the corpus of Hugo de Groot, we see a really sustained attention to the Roman trial of Jesus. And this is also something that has gone totally unnoted, almost totally unnoted in a lot of the history of modern international law. So Hugo Grotius' greatest work, I discovered in the process of writing this book, his greatest work is actually a massive, fabulously learned 12-volume commentary on the Old and New Testaments. Of course, in the process of commenting so painstakingly and brilliantly on the sacred page, he deals with the legal questions raised by the narratives of the Roman trial of Jesus. But beyond this, Grotius actually writes himself a Senecan verse tragedy called Christus Patiens, Christ's Suffering, which I think this exhibits not only his kind of tragic and poetic predilections, but his fascination specifically with the Roman trial of Jesus. Okay, so we have the first words of the Justinianate Code of Roman law. We have at the beginning of the modern epoch of international law, Grotius is concerned with the Roman trial. And then I also have chapter 4 in the book, on the fact, which has again gone almost entirely unnoticed by historians of the late Roman Empire, that according to a number of the chroniclers of the epoch, the last pagan Roman emperor produced a text called the Memoirs of Pilate as a propaganda piece to demonstrate the guilt of Jesus and, broadly speaking, the innocence of Pontius Pilate as a way of combating the Constantinian revolution. This seems like the sort of thing that would more or less be well known in the historiography. I believe it's Eusebius. I haven't looked up it is in fact Eusebius who says that in the Eastern Roman Empire in the early 4th century, the names of Pilate and Jesus were on the lips of all the school children. And so at the very beginning of the Christianization of the empire, we again see the centrality of the legal drama that the book is beginning to explore. Let me just say a few words about the reception of this legal drama. And of course, the reception begins in the New Testament itself. So the New Testament preserves for us very, very early recollections, different recollections of a drama which occurs in Jerusalem. And the first recollection of this drama, the Roman trial of Jesus, of course, does not appear in the Gospels. The Gospels, as many of us will know, were written, this is totally uncontroversial, were written after the epistles of St. Paul. And in 1 Corinthians, which is arguably the first, or certainly one of the first epistles that Paul of Tarsus wrote, in one of the first chapters of 1 Corinthians, Paul says that if the rulers of this age had known who Jesus was, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Now, I think this verse is very interesting, and it's significant for my book and my larger project for a couple of reasons. One is that when Paul refers to the rulers of this age, the Greek is aion, and the Latin is saeculum. And so in both the Innocence of Pontius Pilate and My Political Life of Jesus, I try to show that the language of aion and saeculum in the Greek and the Latin New Testaments is really the ultimate root of the concept of the secular in the European tradition, which of course must be distinguished from late modern concepts of secularism. So these are etymologically and historically related concepts, but let's say morphologically very, very different. So the one reason I find this verse so fascinating is that Paul is already talking about a saeculum, an aion, and he's also saying that the rulers of the aion did not recognize who Jesus was. And this, I think, indicates that everyone involved in the crucifixion of Jesus is in some sense, for the Apostle Paul, writing within living memory of the crucifixion, innocent of the death of Christ, because they did not know that he was the Lord of glory. So the question of innocence is raised in this passage in a way that I find quite interesting. Needless to say, Paul does not believe they are totally innocent, the rulers of the aion, whoever they may be, who are responsible for the death of Jesus. But nevertheless, I want to stress the fact that the question of innocence in the legal drama contained in the Gospels is recognized from before the Gospels are even written. It's recognized by the earliest Christian community. So one thing I do in the book, which I hope will be of interest to those on the call, presumably everyone who's dialed in has some interest in the reception history of the Roman trial of Jesus, and quite remarkably, there has never been a kind of synthetic study of the reception of the Roman trial of Jesus in varying traditions. So I have chapters. A part of the book is devoted to 4 consecutive chapters on the question of Pilate and Jesus in pagan tradition, Judaic tradition, Islamic tradition, and varying Christian traditions. So I just very, very briefly want to introduce you, and this has never been done before, which I find quite remarkable. But I want to introduce you to some of my findings in those chapters before, in the concluding 5 minutes or so, I will introduce you to the larger sort of substantive arguments set forward in the book. So in pagan tradition, it's quite fascinating. Some of you might have an interest in the Church Fathers. And the Church Fathers preserved for us not only a number of fragments of the earliest Greek philosophers, such as Heraclitus. I think this is actually worth mentioning in passing, that were it not for the Church Fathers, almost all of the fragments of Heraclitus we now possess would in fact be lost. But they also, the Church Fathers also preserved many sayings of the pagan deities, specifically the pagan deities on the life and death of Jesus. And before I began researching this topic, I had no idea that we had surviving oracles from the Greco-Roman deities about the life and death of Jesus. And one of the many interesting things about these oracles is that the gods do not agree among themselves about the death of Jesus. So one goddess, Hecate, claims that Jesus was a most righteous and noble man who was wrongfully put to death. She's not entirely clear as to, in our surviving sources, as to how he was put to death. But nevertheless, she holds Jesus in high regard. And Augustine stresses this kind of pagan reverence for Jesus in certain circles. The god Apollo, on the other hand, and it's worth noting that it is the god Apollo who calls Socrates the wisest of the Athenians. The god Apollo does not hold Jesus in very high regard. And what's more, Apollo seems to be aware that there was some question of the culpability for the death of Jesus, whether it fell primarily on Pontius Pilate himself or on the temple authorities in Jerusalem. But one way or another, Apollo says very, very straightforwardly that Jesus was justly condemned to the worst death, which we can take to be a straightforward reference to the crucifixion. Similarly, all of my formal training is in philosophy and the history of philosophy, and it is simply not well known that the death of Jesus was a topos in philosophical texts, beginning perhaps as early as the late 1st century, but certainly as early as the 2nd century. So I'll just mention in passing a fragment, not very well known, well studied, but not well known fragment of a letter by a Syriac philosopher, Mara bar Serapion, which might conceivably have been written around the same time as the Gospels. It might be later. We need not get into the details on this. But one of the first references we have to the death of Jesus explicitly connects the death of Jesus to the deaths of Socrates and Pythagoras. This is a pagan philosopher who reverences both Socrates and Pythagoras immensely. And if you have any interest in this, there's more on this really fascinating philosophical fragment on the death of Jesus, which sees him as being wrongly condemned in my Political Life of Jesus. On the other hand, we have two philosophers, Celsus and Porphyry, who write very, very forcefully about the condemnation of Jesus. And like the god Apollo, they see him as being quite a sinister or a contemptible figure who is rightly condemned by the various judges in the scene. But what I want to stress is that there are numerous, quite suggestive, relatively early and highly divided references in surviving pagan fragments to the death of Jesus. We find these both in the kind of philosophical corpus and in the oracular, or what we would call religious corpus. I'm not sure that language is so precise necessarily. In the Judaic tradition, we find something similar. And I want to make it very clear in the coming moments that the salience and the significance of the death of Jesus in Jewish-Christian relations is, of course, an immensely sensitive and complex topic, which I deal with in much greater detail, and with, I have reason to believe, the necessary nuance and sensitivity in the book. So I'm just referring in the coming moments in the broadest, kind of most schematic and morphological terms to what I realize is very delicate terrain. But it seems to me that in the Judaic tradition as well, from the very beginning, we have differing conclusions about the question of the death of Jesus. The famous Testimonium Flavianum, the famous reference to the death of Jesus in the writings of Flavius Josephus, attributes kind of not equal, but substantial responsibility for the death of Jesus, both to the temple elites and to the Roman prefect of Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate. And since I've just talked about the kind of the significance of Jesus in philosophical tradition in the first centuries of our era, I will note, which is again not always pointed out, but Josephus introduces Jesus when in his chronicles of the history of his people, he introduces Jesus as a sophos aner, a wise man, which I think this is quite remarkable that Josephus sees Jesus not necessarily as a philosopher, but as someone who morphologically is connected to, let's say, a tradition of wisdom. In the Talmud and the Toledot Yeshu, we see a very different picture, one which, I stress this, one which has corollaries in pagan tradition. And that is to see Jesus as one who was rightly condemned at the conclusion of a valid legal process. And if you're interested in exploring some of that material a bit further, I refer you to the book. I say the same for the next couple of minutes on the death of Jesus in Islamic tradition. I was absolutely astonished how little there is an entire stanza in the Qur'an on the death of Jesus, and the literature on this theme is not what one would expect. It is not nearly as well commented upon in the critical literature as one might think. So the reason this is so relevant to my particular project is precisely because the question of guilt or innocence is, in a sense, sidestepped by the Qur'an in an interesting way, because the Qur'an claims that while it appears that Jesus was crucified by the Judeans, nevertheless, he was not crucified, but because God loved him, he was raised to the skies. I'm not quoting exactly for the record, and if you're interested in the precise wording, it's in the book. But there is some kind of obscurity in the Quran. But nevertheless, this stanza makes it perfectly clear that the death of Jesus is a question for the Quran, a question whether Jesus died, that is worth the attention of the faithful and of commentators on the Quran. And there's a very rich vein of Orthodox Muslim commentary, tafsir, on the Quran, in which the theory is put forward that Jesus was not crucified, but a kind of body double. Either an actual man was crucified in his place, or that some sort of phantom was crucified, which appeared to be the body of Jesus, but was not. So this finally brings us around. I hope you followed. We've talked about pagan traditions, Judaic traditions, Islamic traditions regarding the trial and death of Jesus, focusing, I suppose, more on the death so far. But this Islamic concept of a body double finally brings us back to Christian traditions, because in the first centuries of our era, various Gnostic texts suggest, similarly to the tafsir, the commentary tradition on the Quran, that Jesus was not himself crucified, rather some sort of phantom or real person was crucified in his place. So the innocence of Pontius Pilate can be established in a variety of ways. One can claim with the god Apollo that Pilate was right to condemn Jesus to the worst of deaths. One can also claim that the temple authorities were just in so condemning him. One can claim that he was not crucified at all. But the innocence of Pontius Pilate really enters the European tradition in a really significant way with the figure of Firmianus Lactantius, who was a courtier at the courts of Constantine the Great. Constantine the Great, of course, Constantine I is the first Christianizing Roman emperor. I stress the word Christianizing because one of the things I discovered in writing this book, discovered meaning I did not know this and I had never heard it, but I certainly did not, I am not responsible for the discovery, is that Constantine might not have been the first Christian emperor. In fact, according to many church fathers, I detail this in a long note, a certain Philip the Arab in the 3rd century rather than the 4th was the first Christian emperor, and he might well have been martyred along with his wife and son because of his Christian faith. But I find this worth mentioning. Okay, but Lactantius, Firmianus Lactantius, was a courtier at the in the household of Constantine the Great. So he represents a kind of official imperial voice in some ways at the very birth of the Christian Roman Empire. And he argues that Pontius Pilate is innocent because he never pronounced a sentence. Rather, he simply handed over Jesus to the Judeans to be crucified. So one of the things I do in this book is trace up the tradition inaugurated by Lactantius, trying to indicate ways in which it is highly influential. It is not, for me, ultimately exegetically well-grounded whatsoever. And it is also, unfortunately, linked at a variety of points and in lamentable ways to the history of anti-Semitism or Christian animosity to the Jewish communities in Europe down the centuries. But standing against Lactantius, and very important for my project, is perhaps unsurprisingly to those of you who are still with us, unsurprisingly, Augustine of Hippo. Augustine of Hippo writes with astonishing color and force and legal acuity about the Roman trial of Jesus in the early 5th century. And I have a chapter on Augustine's really extraordinarily impressive exegesis of the Roman trial of Jesus in John. And one of the things I argue is that Augustine's interpretation of the fulminous line in John 18:36, that Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, is not only connected in ways which I cannot explore here, but I'm happy to discuss further. This articulation by Jesus of a kingdom which is not of this world is not only essential to the question of guilt and innocence as it plays out with really great nuance and suggestiveness in the Roman trial in the Gospel of John, but it is also Augustine's interpretation of this phrase, which influences the constitution of the secular, or if you prefer, the constitution of the differentiation of ecclesia and the church and the state in the West down centuries, all the way indeed to the year of grace 2024. So just, I have, I think, literally 1 minute left, and all I'll say is that Augustine's very, very brilliant reading of the Roman trial of Jesus in John is transmitted in the Middle Ages by Aquinas in the Catena Aurea, the chain of gold. I try to show that Dante, Marsilius of Padua, and Lorenzo Valla all draw upon it in their late medieval theorizations of the conflict between empire and papacy. I've already mentioned Grotius' fascination in the early modern period with the Roman trial of Jesus, and I could add that parts 3 and 4 of Hobbes' Leviathan, which are really quite scandalously neglected on the whole in Hobbes literature, feature very, very significant discussions of the Roman trial of Jesus, and are self-consciously drawing on Dante, Marsilius, and the Augustinian tradition. I try to show that one of the great Christian enlighteners of the late 17th century, Christian Thomasius, who is uncontroversially significant in as a theorist of the secularization of the early German states, and a culture of religious toleration in Europe emerging in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Thomasius writes acutely and significantly on the Roman trial of Jesus, and specifically on the question of Pilate's innocence. And then finally, the book ends by noting the fact, which I hope will be of interest to some of you, that Jean-Jacques Rousseau engages in an unspoken, a definite, a demonstrable, yet inexplicit critique of the Augustinian tradition of reading the Roman trial of Jesus in the very final chapter of his social contract on civil religion. Rousseau finds the Augustinian reading of the trial in John to be the source of all that he finds distasteful and problematic in Christian Europe. And it goes without saying that this should be of interest, since Rousseau's text, as I tried to show, this is somewhat controversial within Rousseau and French Revolutionary scholarship, but nevertheless, I believe Rousseau's social contract has an appreciable and a significant influence on Jacobin thought during the French Revolution. So the idea that some sort of contest over the Roman trial of Jesus is going on in the very final pages of Rousseau's social contract, I think is quite significant for those of us who see the French Revolution as a watershed in European legal and political history, the effects of which we still observe today.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great overview of the book and helpful elaboration of a couple of those chapters. Now, before taking audience questions, I have a number of my own, but I'd also like to make a couple observations about what I take to be some of the main strengths of the book. First, in reading it, I'm deeply impressed at the ambition of the project, and that is to say, as a grand narrative tracing throughout the course of Western intellectual history, the significance of the trial of Jesus for the development of this concept of the secular, of the realm of coercive or temporal authority is distinguished from spiritual and moral authority, epitomized in Christ's words that my kingdom is not of this world. And to see, I think, a project that runs from the scriptures up to Rousseau and really beyond in the very last chapter, it's just impressive in its breadth, its scope, and its ambition. So very well done on that score. Another important contribution that I think the book makes to the field of intellectual history, as well as the history of political philosophy, is it recenters the theological in interpreting texts in political thought and political theory. So, for instance, it's not infrequently the case that the second part of the Defender of the Peace, Marsilius of Padua's great work of political philosophy and defense of the primacy of the Holy Roman Emperor in temporal affairs over the papacy, the second part is nearly entirely dedicated to scriptural exegesis. And this is often viewed, I think, by political theorists, political philosophers as kind of extraneous to his ultimate project, to the political theory that he elaborates in the first part of the Defender of the Peace. And I think one finds sometimes a similar dynamic with Hobbes' Leviathan when scholars sometimes tend to bracket the extensive scriptural exegesis and theological critique that Hobbes performs, aimed ultimately, I think, at Bellarmine's theory of the potestas indirecta. But I think your work really has the merit of recentering scriptural exegesis and the theological points that these political theorists are making to the study of their thought. with the implication that we can't have an adequate historical understanding of their thought without taking into account their scriptural and theological views. So I think that the book makes a very important methodological contribution in that way to the study of political thought. Now, some questions that I have about the main thesis of the book, as well as where you take the book towards the end. The first question that I have is, a common narrative in historical accounts of the development of this concept of the secular in Western European political thought posits that the concept of the secular really emerges in earnest with the rediscovery in the West of Aristotle's political philosophy, and especially his account of authority as deriving from nature independently of grace or divine right. And I'm wondering, how do you think about that narrative as perhaps supplementing, fleshing out some of the work that you do around the trial of Jesus and the explanatory value that exegesis of that episode has for the development of the secular? But do you think this other kind of narrative also has some explanatory power in accounting for this notion of the secular?
It's a very good question, Stephen, and I confess it's the first time I've been asked this. So I don't have, in a sense, it's one that, as you will have seen, I don't take up in the book, and I have not given any sort of systematic thought to. And of course, it's interesting, since you mentioned Marsilius. Of course, Aristotle stands at the forefront of the first part of the Defense for Pacis, and as I point out, Pilate makes his appearance on the last page of the first part of Defense for Pacis, where Marsilius refers to the execution of Christ by, I believe he calls him Caesar's vice regent, thus setting up the kind of biblical drama of part 2, which you referred to. I suppose my argument, I have thought a bit about this, my argument would run something along these lines. I suppose, and maybe we can use Marsilius as kind of indicating the structure of the argument that I would want to make. Of course, as a historical argument running down centuries, it would have to be made kind of empirically at much greater length than I will ever undertake, certainly in the next 90 seconds. But I think I would want to say something along these lines, that it's not, my argument is not so much that the trial of Jesus or the figure of the Ion Cyclum in the New Testament is the sole or even the most prominent inspiration for the constitution of what we can broadly call the secular in European history, which I think goes through very, very distinct phases, which I try to at least indicate in one of the chapters in my book. I mean, it begins with the very emergence of the term secular in the lexicon of the West, because this is not, in any meaningful sense, as I show, a Roman legal term, and it becomes a Roman legal term precisely in Christian law. And then, of course, secularizatio and secularitas, so secularization, secularity, have histories that begin a bit later in the tradition. But what I'm trying to say is this: I think even if, so the language of the secular is, I would argue, derived from Christian usage and from the New Testament. So the concept of an order which is proper only in a temporal sense and until the end of the ages, or until the end of the world. However, the language can differ, because according to Paul, we're living in the end of the ages. But let's say until the return of Christ. This concept is a distinctly Christian and apocalyptic one. And so to that extent, the constitution of etymologically, the constitution of the secular is Christian tout court. That's the argument I would want to make. But using the language of the secular to kind of create certain zones or domains of social and legal and political life might not always be inspired by Christian usage or motives. And I think the recovery and the recovery of Aristotle and the kind of systematic commenting upon Aristotle is certainly going to figure in any sort of history of constitution of the secular. But I guess this is what I would argue. Not that the Roman trial of Jesus is alone in the constitution of the secular, but without the Roman trial of Jesus, whatever Aristotelian sort of rationale for secularization could have been put forward would not have been successful. And I think you see this, of course. I mean, it was not only in the Christian West that Aristotle was commented upon, right? And it does not seem to me that in other, let's say, civilizational or imperial zones, where there was, in fact, not just a strong, but even a prior valorization of Aristotle and reception of Aristotle, you don't see a similar constitution of the distinction between the spheres, as you very helpfully put, the spheres of coercive power and moral authority, state and church.
Now, another question that I was left with at the end of the book, and I think that many readers might also share, is in addition to John 18, another sort of central locus classicus in the scriptures for this concept of the secular is Christ's injunction to render unto Caesar those things which are Caesar's, and unto God those things which are God's. And that text has much less emphasis in your narrative than what maybe some might expect. And so I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on the importance of that passage, you think, or perhaps the lack of importance of that passage in accounting for the concept of the secular, and then perhaps also why you ultimately give primacy to John 18, to the trial of Jesus.
So to deal with the second question first, the reason I give primacy is in part because I think certainly in interpretations such as Marsilius, Jesus' statement, "My kingdom is not of this world," makes it very clear that that the secular is constituted not by the state. The secular is constituted by the church. Jesus is articulating a kingdom which stands beside and indeed within and above the empire that Pilate represents in the province of Judea. But the saying the saying about Caesar and God, in a sense, makes it seems to me less clear in the saying about Caesar and God that the distinction between them is coming from within the domain which is claimed by Jesus for God. And I think that's at least interesting. For those who are really, interested in my own thoughts on that passage, I do deal with that scene, those scenes rather, in my life of Jesus, my political life of Jesus. And I actually rely upon, to keep it simple, I rely upon the earliest commentary we have, the earliest surviving commentary we have on the Gospel of Mark, which, according to modern critical scholarship, is also the earliest canonical gospel we have. That of course, can be disputed. We need not take up that question here. But according to the earliest surviving Christian commentary on Mark, a distinction is drawn, and the terms used in Latin are quite interesting, between Jesus. According to this first commentator, what Jesus is saying is that you should give to Caesar your tribute to him because it is required of you, because you are forced to. Coactivo. You are expected under pain of penalty to render unto Caesar, and therefore you are free to do so. And this is exactly what the Zealots denied, is that a faithful Judean was free to render monetary tribute to Caesar. And so Jesus is, in this sense, liberating, in fact, his hearers within the domain of commerce to do as they must, to cooperate with the established authorities. But then, according to this earliest commentator on the Gospel of Mark, he's also enjoining his hearers and followers to give to God all that belongs to him. And not me, this is not a modern or a late modern sort of, romantic reading of the Gospels. This 7th century commentator says, that which must be given to God can only be given freely. Libenter. And so Jesus is saying, do as you must within the domain of exchange, and do freely out of love what God calls you to do for him. And so I think Stephen, I'm not sure if this is as full a reply as you were hoping for. But again, your distinction, which is in the tradition, and I hope in the book, your distinction between the domains of potestas, coercion, and auctoritas, authority, persuasion, love, ultimately virtue, is seen by this very early Christian monastic commentator in that saying. So I think there's a lot of richness to be explored, but you're absolutely right that I don't think there's a single reference to that in this book. If anyone dialed in is interested in more on that text, it is in My Life of Jesus.
Now we have a question from the audience. I'll just read it. You reflect in your book, I Judge No One, on how Jesus makes it abundantly clear that his kingdom will necessarily include suffering and death when he says, "Get behind me, Satan," to Peter, after Peter rebukes the possibility of Christ's impending death. Theologian Eric Peterson makes it clear that martyrdom, those joined to Christ's sufferings by their sufferings, is foundational for the origin and continuation of the church. How would you reflect on the necessity of martyrdom for the origin and continuation of the church, as Eric Peterson argues? Could this be another way of showing the radically distinct nature of the kingdom of God?
It's a very good question, a very deep and difficult question, because I feel, as one who is not suffering, and has not suffered, I really hesitate to comment on the calling of those who have and do and will, for the name of Christ. But yes, I mean, I certainly think I would agree with Peterson. I confess, since the questioner is interested, I confess that Peterson is someone I've read in, but I have not read as deeply in or as thoroughly as I should. And I think that in very, very broad terms, if one is to see Schmidt and Peterson as kind of opposing one another in 20th century political theology, I think my project is more Petersonian than Schmittian in many crucial respects. So I do think that martyrdom is declared in the Gospels as part of the the disciples' calling and place in the world. It's exemplified by Jesus. We see this in the New Testament. One of the only references, in fact, no, the only reference to Pontius Pilate outside of the Gospels and Acts is in 1 Timothy 6:13, which is a verse that Grotius comments upon very nicely, and I deal with in the book. But in 1 Timothy 6:13, we read that Jesus made the good confession, bona confessio, before Pontius Pilate, and so he is depicted, I think, in this text as a martyr, as a witness unto death, to the truth. This is, of course, what he also says in John 18: "For this I was born, and this I came into the world, to give witness to the truth." The Greek there is martyr, to marturein. Okay, but the last thing I would just say is that something I do, it is not prominent in either book, but since the questioner, to my immense astonishment and gratification, has read my book on Jesus, I do actually refer to the fact that martyrdom is very real in our day, and martyrdom is a 21st century reality, very, very well documented 21st century reality. So whatever I might say, with in the context in which I find myself, really can only be by way of kind of homage to Christians in many parts of the world who are not thinking about these things but doing them.
Now, in the book, I noticed that you emphasize very much the fact that the tradition of interpretation of John 18 that sees the affirmation of secularity in that passage originates in an African Christian milieu, especially the figure of Augustine, Gelasius. And I'm wondering, is there anything you think about the nature of the early Christian milieu in Africa, perhaps the political situation there, that helps account for why they seem to have, so to speak, pioneered this interpretation of the text?
So, Stephen, this is a really fine question. I appreciate it, and I think the answer is that there does seem to be. Now, it's worth mentioning that so not only you refer to the African Pope Gelasius, there's a chapter on him, and of course it goes without saying that, as all the medieval chroniclers remind us, Augustine was an African bishop, and as Augustine himself reminds us, he was an African bishop. But so too was Lactantius. So, and I referred to it seems that Lactantius was African as well. That is not quite so well attested, but it's at least conceivable. And so it would be improper. I'm not attributing this to you. I'm saying it would be improper for me to suggest that there is a kind of an uncontested African interpretation, which is represented by Augustine, and unique to Africa, and that is picked up in Europe, because there's reason to believe, as I've just suggested, that the more Eastern interpretation of the Roman trial has its representatives in the African tradition. But yes, as you suggest, I mean, there does seem to be, and I have not worked this out in detail, I've not published on it, so I have no kind of conclusive findings to report. But I suppose my intuition rather than my claim, my intuition rather than my proposition, is that the peculiar history of persecution and the negotiation of the history of persecution in Africa, in North Africa, Roman Africa, probably has something to do with the Augustinian interpretation of Matthew 18:36, and the strong distinction between what Augustine calls all human dominations and the kingdom of God. which Augustine says can only be, we only enter the kingdom of God by believing and by loving. And of course, it goes without saying that the question of the Donatists and Augustine's hand in certain questions of imperial politics is immensely complicated, and there's a very, very rich literature on that. But nevertheless, I would echo you in saying that the Africans of the 4th and 5th century seem to present a particular reception, which I would think is rooted in their collective experience.
Now, at the end of the book, you make the very interesting suggestion that there's a strain of modern thought represented by Rousseau, which grasps that Christ is actually responsible for the concept of secularity. And you contrast Rousseau on this point with Voltaire. But Rousseau laments this fact in as much as it separates the sacred and the secular, which he thinks should be combined not in the church, but in the state. I'm wondering, do you see any vestiges in modern politics of Rousseau's desire for the reunification of the sacred and the secular? So, for example, do you see in revolutionary political movements an attempt to sacralize the state by making the state responsible, so to speak, for transfiguring the human condition into a kind of earthly paradise? Is resacralization, or maybe to use Vogelin's terminology, redivinization of the state, is that a useful hermeneutic for these kinds of movements?
Again, I kind of apologize for simply confirming and saying yes. I think absolutely, to some extent, without again fully developing these questions, which are very complex. But the final chapter of the book points in precisely the direction you've just sketched out. That the revolutionary modernity, in the case of Rousseau and the Jacobins, was self-consciously inaugurated in reaction to the claims of the church for itself, the libertas ecclesiae, the moral authority and liberty of the church. And I think the seemingly inevitable persecution of Christian communities that follows from most late modern revolutionary programs would indicate the fact that the such moral claims made by Christians are perceived as a threat by many such movements and fronts.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much again, David, for your time. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for dialing in. We've very much enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Dusenbury this afternoon. And thank you once again to the Institute for Human Ecology for generously co-sponsoring the event. And I hope you all have a great afternoon. And we hope to see you at future IHE events. Thank you very much.